Welcome everybody to the latest in a series of webinars organized by the Economic Research Forum and the World Bank to discuss issues around a recent World Bank report on transparency in the Middle East and North Africa region. Delighted to welcome you all today to focus particularly on the topic of labor markets. Our title is Measurement of Labour Market Outcomes and Female Labour Force Participation in MENA. And we've got a fantastic lineup of people to speak about that issue for you. Let me just quickly introduce myself. My name is Ramesh Vaitalingam, and I'm a economics writer and consultant based in the UK. So it's afternoon for me. I know it's afternoon in Cairo, but we're also welcoming people from Washington and perhaps elsewhere in the States. So good morning to you. I've been working with the Economic Research Forum for about 3 or 4 years, particularly as one of the founding editors of the Forum website, which is a policy portal for discussion of economic and social policy issues pertaining to the region, bringing together researchers together with policy audiences. And that's what the intention of this discussion is today. So we'll shortly be hearing from Nelly El-Mallakh, who's at the Paris School of Economics and is also the contributor of a chapter to the World Bank report. And she's going to be taking us through that report in a little while. And then we've got 2 discussants, people who've been long associated with the Economic Research Forum. Ragui Assaad, who's coming in from Minnesota, so even earlier in the morning for him. Ragui's long been working on issues around the labour market and leads for the ERF on labour and human development. And Mona Saeed will be our second discussant, who's an associate professor of economics at the American University of Cairo, and has also done a lot of work in the area of labour markets and gender issues around the labour market. So welcome to all the panelists. Welcome to you as attendees, participants. We're going to have the 3 presentations, but then we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. There are 2 ways in which you can contribute questions. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom bar, you'll see Q&A, which you can click on and type in a question at any point during the conversation, and everyone will see that, and the panelists will be able to answer either by typing responses, or they can answer when they next get to speak. There's also in the participants to the right of your Zoom screen, there's a facility to raise your hand, which will draw attention to the fact that you would like to put a question. And if things go well, we'll be able to get you online to ask a question. So that's enough from me. Sorry again, we're starting a bit late, but we can run a little bit over because I'm sure there'll be lots to talk about. And I'm going to hand over to Nelly to get her presentation up on screen and tell us about her chapter in this report. Welcome, Nelly. Glad you were able to join us.
Thank you, Ramesh. So today I'm going to present some of the results of the MENA Economic Update 2020, and particularly my talk will focus on data gaps, definitions, and measurement of labor market outcomes in MENA. So the MENA Economic Update starts with the observation that most MENA economies suffered from chronic low growth over the past decades. If we look together at this graph, the blue diamonds represent the average growth rate of GDP per capita in each MENA economy, while the red horizontal line represents the average growth rate of corresponding income categories. So for instance, if we look at high income countries, upper middle income countries, or low middle income countries, we find that most MENA economies had witnessed a GDP per capita growth rate that are below the median of the corresponding income group. The MENA Economic Update 2020 highlights the question of data transparency in the MENA region, and particularly it provides empirical evidence on a positive association between the statistical capacity of MENA economies and regional development. And we also highlight in the report that advanced economies have modern data collection systems, while most MENA economies lag behind in terms of their capacity to generate data. And furthermore, we highlight that there is little attention that has been devoted to the cost of opaque data systems. In my talk today, I'll be mentioning data gaps and measurement inconsistencies in the labor market. And importantly, I will highlight how these issues can be an important challenge to policymaking. I will also show how MENA economies do not systematically provide clear definitions when it comes to how they define employment or unemployment. And we highlight as well that MENA economies do not follow the ILO definitions, but even if they do so, they do not accurately report the definitions that they use. So the ILO definition is considered in general as the gold standard when it comes to the measurement of unemployment rate, and it's computed as the ratio between the share of the unemployed population and the total labor force, which includes the the sum of the employed individuals and unemployed individuals. And the definition of the ILO therefore requires us to think about three dimensions. The first one is the definition of unemployment. The second one is the definition of employment. And the third one is the definition of the age of the working population. So according to the ILO, the unemployed are those who are without work, available for work, and seeking work, while the employed population are those who are either in paid employment or self-employment. And the working age population corresponds to the age category between 15 and 64 years old. And if we look at this table, we have collected information from National Statistical Agency's websites, and we report whether the unemployment definition that was published on their website follows the ILO definition of unemployment. And to do so, we consider whether the unemployment definition is consistent with the ILO, whether the employment definition is consistent with the one advocated by the ILO, and finally, whether the age of the working population is also in line with the ILO standards. And as you can see, we find that most MENA economies do not quite clearly specify the definitions that they used when they define employment or unemployment. And in many cases, we find that they do not use the correct working age population, which is in many cases 15 and above, instead of focusing on those aged between 15 and 64 years old. In the report, we rely on 3 waves of the labor market panel surveys in 3 different countries. We use the most recent survey round in Egypt and Jordan and Tunisia, and we rely for Egypt on the 2018 round. For Tunisia, we rely on the 2016, and in Tunisia, we rely on the 2014. And we compute unemployment rates following 4 definitions, and these definitions, they vary depending on whether we rely on the market versus the extended definition of employment, and whether we rely on the broad versus the standard definition of unemployment. The market definition of employment only considers individuals who are employed in market economic activities as employed, while the extended definition of employment additionally considers individuals who either engage in subsistent economic activities as employed, but also those who engage in market economic activities. And the difference between the standard definition of unemployment and the broad definition of unemployment is in active job search versus inactive job search. So the standard definition of unemployment requires the individual to be actively searching for employment in order to be considered as unemployed, while the broad definition of unemployment does not require active job search for the individual to be considered as unemployed. In this table, we report the total unemployment rates by comparing the labor market panel surveys that are made available by ERF versus national estimates. Here we report the total unemployment rate according to the extended definition of unemployment and search required, and we compare it with the national estimate that we collected from national statistical agencies. We report the results for Egypt in 2018, Jordan 2016, and Tunisia 2014. And for instance, we find that the unemployment rate according to the extended definition search required stands at 6.2%, while the national estimate is 9.9%. For Jordan, we find that the unemployment rate is equal to 18.8%, while the national estimate is equal to 15.3%. And finally, for Tunisia, we computed an unemployment rate relying on the extended definition search required of 11% versus a national estimate of 15%. We also did a similar exercise for female unemployment rates, and we compared the labor market panel surveys and the national estimates. And here we report the 4 definitions. Again, the differences between definitions, these definitions is whether we rely on the market versus the extended definition of employment, and whether we rely on the active job search or inactive job search. So we report the results relying on the most recent survey round from Egypt and Jordan and Tunisia. And we find as well that the unemployment rate, if we rely on the extended definition search required, is equal to 9.2%, while the national estimate is equal to 21.4%. In Jordan, we also found estimate of female unemployment rate equal to 36% versus 24% for the national estimate. And Tunisia, we found an unemployment rate of 14% versus about 22% for the national estimate. We further investigate the role of definitions in the computation of female labor force participation rates in MENA. And here we report the female labor force participation rates according to the four definitions that I just mentioned. And we report the results using the most recent survey round in each country. And importantly, we find large discrepancies between female labor force participation rates when we rely on the extended versus the market definition of labor force participation. And these discrepancies are particularly large in the case of Tunisia and in the case of Egypt, where we computed the rate of labor force participation is almost double when we rely on the extended definition versus the market definition. We also computed the predicted female labor force participation rates in Egypt by age groups, and we relied on data from 1998 to 2018 from Egypt. And if we look at this graph, we see that female labor force participation rates, they follow an inverted U-shaped curve, and they tend to peak around the age 40 to 45. And we also find that female labor force participation rates in Egypt in 2006 were particularly high. And this corresponds also with a period in which Egypt witnessed a very high growth rate of 5%. When we look at the predicted female labor force participation rates in Jordan by age groups, we also find the same pattern. We find that female labor force participation rates in Jordan tend to peak around the age 30 to 35 years old. And we also find that female labor force participation rates in Jordan were higher in 2010 compared to the year 2016. And when we also compute the growth rate in the 5 years preceding the survey round, we find that Jordan witnessed the growth rate of GDP of 3% between 2005 and 2009, while it was growing only at a negative rate at -2% between 2011 and 2015. And we also explore in the report whether the low female labor force participation rates in the MENA can be attributed to a generational issue. And in this graph, we show women educational attainment by age cohorts. And we report the results for Jordan in 2016, for Tunisia in 2014, and for Egypt in 2018. And we consider 3 levels of educational attainment. The first one is the no educational attainment. The second one is secondary or less education. And the third one is above secondary education. And the main message of this figure is to show you that women have become more and more educated in recent years, and that younger women tend to be much more educated compared to older cohorts. So if you look at the case of Jordan, for instance, in 2016, if you consider women aged between 25 and 34 years old, you find that 21% of women aged between 25 and 34 years old had no educational attainment. And this figure goes to up to 62% for women aged between 55 and 64 years old. By contrast, if you consider the highest level of educational attainment in the data, which is above secondary education, which is represented by the blue color, we find that for those aged between 25 and 34 years old, 42% of women had above secondary education in Jordan, while among those aged between 55 and 64 years old, only 15% had an above secondary education. And this pattern is also consistent in the data and also in Tunisia and in Egypt in 2018. We also compared the observed female labor force participation rates in Egypt by education with the predicted female labor force participation rates in Egypt by education, comparing by using data from 1998 to 2018. And it's important to highlight that the predicted probabilities are computed relying on a model in which we control for various covariates, including age group categories, educational attainment, marital status, rural residence, as well as regional fixed effects, parental education, and wealth quintile, as well, of course, as year fixed effects. And as you can see, we find that women labor force participation rates are the highest among the highly educated women who have either above secondary education, who have either secondary or above education. And we also find the same patterns in Jordan. We find that women who have above secondary education are also those who have the highest levels of female labor force participation rates. And this figure from Tunisia also confirms the same pattern. We further rely on a Blender-Oaxaca decomposition technique, which is widely used in the literature to study labor market outcomes by groups. And here we compare the younger versus the older age cohorts. And what it does, this estimation technique, is that it decomposes mean differences between two groups into two components. And in an explained component, which is the part of the outcome differential that is due to differences in the predictors that we include in our model, and an unexplained component, which is the part of the outcome differential that cannot be explained by the covariates that we chose to include in our model. So these are the results of the Blender-Oaxaca decomposition technique. We report in the first two columns the results for Egypt in 2018, and column 3 and 4 the results for Jordan in 2016, in columns 5 and 6 the results for Tunisia in 2014, and finally in the last two columns we report the results relying on the World Bank Global Micro Database, and it includes information on 7 countries, including Djibouti, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, the West Bank and Gaza, and Yemen. So if you look at the first column, it reports the results for Egypt. We find that the old cohort had an estimated female labor force participation rate of 25%, while the younger cohort had a female labor force participation rate of 24%, and the difference between the two groups is not statistically significant. And when we look at the results for Jordan in 2016, we actually find that the older cohort had a female labor force participation rate of only 13%, while the younger cohort had a female labor force participation rate of 29%. This leads to a gap that's reported in the third row of about 16 percentage points. And what the Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition technique does is that it decomposes this gap of 16 percentage points into two components, the explained component and the unexplained component. The explained component is the explained differences that are due to the covariates that we included in the model. And if you look at column 4, we decompose this explained component into three categories. The educational component, which includes an individual educational attainment, the family component, which includes a vector of marital status as well as the number of children at the household, and the other control include the rural residence as well as parental education, wealth quintile, and region of residence. And as you can see, most of the explained difference between the young and the old cohort in terms of female labor force participation rate is due to differences in education. So about half of the gap can be explained by educational differences, and this explained component is mostly due to differences in education. And when we look at the case of Tunisia in 2014, we actually find even a more interesting pattern where we find that the old cohort has a female labor force participation rate of 21%, while the younger cohort has a female labor force participation rate of 35%, which leads to a gap of about 13 percentage points between the young and the old cohort. And we actually find that all of this gap is due to differences in the covariates that we included in our analysis. And importantly, we find that the totality of this gap can be explained by educational differences between the young and the old cohort in Tunisia. And
Nelly, two more minutes, please, Nelly.
Okay.
Wrap up.
Yeah, I'll wrap up. As for the GMD countries, we also find the same pattern. We find that there is a gap between the old and the young cohort in terms of female labor force participation rates. And we find that most of this gap is due to differences in education. We also bring attention to the question of measuring informality in MENA, and we explore four different definitions. The first one, we consider an individual to be employed in informal employment if the individual does not have a work contract or social security. The second definition requires the individual to not have a work contract and social security simultaneously to be considered as informal. And the last two, we consider the two criteria separately. We report the results here on the estimated male and female informality rates. We rely on these various definitions that I just mentioned. And as you can see, depending on the definitions that we employed, we obtained estimations of informality rates in the different in the countries in Egypt and in Jordan and in Tunisia, with the highest estimated informality rates obtained when we use the definition that requires that the individual does not have a work contract or social security to be considered as informal employment. So to conclude, we find that official labor market statistics in MENA are based on ambiguous definitions, which makes it difficult to replicate official statistics using independent data sources. We brought the attention on the question of data transparency and how this can be an issue for policymaking. And importantly, that the question of data transparency is very relevant, since this would help assess the role of women in MENA societies. And we conclude by saying that we find suggestive evidence that the low female labor force participation rates in MENA might be a generational issue, particularly since we find that the gap in female labor force participation rates between the young and the old cohorts is mostly attributed to educational differences between the two groups. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nelly. That's a very clear presentation. If you could stop sharing your screen, then Ragui will be able to share his screen. Thank you. Let me remind viewers that you can write a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom bar, or you can raise your hand. And I'm now delighted to welcome Ragui Assaad to respond to Nelly's presentation. Ragui, over to you. You need to come off mute.
All right, here we go. So thank you very much for this opportunity to comment on this presentation and this rich report. I basically will talk about the three aspects of the presentation. The first argument the presentation makes is kind of the opaque data systems with regard to definitions of employment and unemployment that make the estimation of unemployment rates ambiguous, if not incorrect. Then the second part was about female labor force participation, essentially generational issue. There's a decline across generations that is observed, at least in some of the results. And I will talk about why there are some issues with interpretation when it comes to whether it's an age effect or a generation effect. And then there is the measuring informality and how definitions matter for that. So let's start with the opaque data systems argument. I agree with the overall argument, but I actually disagree that the primary problem is non-compliance with ILO recommendations. In fact, most of the statistical agencies of the region are using very close to ILO recommendations, if not the ILO recommendations themselves. The recommendations have changed somewhat since the 13th conference, the 13th conference of the International Labor Statisticians. The ILO originally, before that conference, was suggesting that the extended definition of the labor force or of employment should be used. And now they are saying that employment is restricted to market work, not the extended definition. And then you have work, which is a more broader definition than employment, which includes subsistence work. But employment should be limited to work for pay or profit, which means market work. And so, and the standard definition of unemployment is one that requires search. These are the standard. Now there are variations on that you can calculate, but I think one has to stick to the standard to be able to calculate something that is comparable. And I think that's the definition that all of the agencies used. It's true that when it comes to reporting labor force and employment, they use a 15 plus, but when it comes to calculating the unemployment rate, they limit it to 15 to 64. So it's incorrect to say that they use 15 plus as the denominator of the unemployment rate. And in any case, the ILO has worked very closely with NSOs to achieve compliance with international recommendations. I think the presentation exaggerates the data problems in terms of that result from these definitional issues, and I'll show you, in fact, the presentation incorrectly calculates some of these measures. So I think the problem is not one of non-compliance, it's one of absence, in the sense that there is an absence of many indicators that we would like to have about the labor market beyond the almost banal indicator of unemployment rate, which really is limited in terms of what it can tell us in our kinds of labor markets that have very large informal sectors. And there's also lack of access of whatever data is collected, it is not accessible. Policymakers, I like to say, don't consume data, they consume analysis. And unless data is available in a modern format that allows analysts and researchers to produce analysis, it's not going to be very useful to policymakers. And these days, modern formats often means microdata. But it also means many more variables that need to be looked at besides labor force participation, employment, and unemployment, which are inadequate to properly understand the function of labor markets in MENA. So we need data on earnings, on informality, which is not present and not at least reported in many. So that's why Nelly could not do a comparison with official definitions because it's not reported. Irregularity, insecurity of employment, extremely important, especially in times of crisis like the ones we are in. It's the people who have casual and irregular and precarious employment who suffer the most. Issues of underemployment, it's not being able to get enough work. You get some work, but not enough to be adequate for your living standards and your livelihoods. Non-wage benefits like health insurance, like vacation, sick leave, also extremely important in the time we're in. So none of these things are being reported regularly, and that's the absence that is really the most serious problem with official data. And then I mentioned the need for modern data products such as public use microsamples so that we can do proper analysis. Tables are no longer adequate in this day and age we're in. So I do agree that there are opaque data systems and they are insufficient, but not in the way that the paper or the presentation shows it. Now, the presentation today said that Nelly is using the extended definition of employment, which is inappropriate. That's not the definition that is being used or that's recommended by the ILO. The definition is the market definition with search requirements. So if I recalculate the unemployment rate using the market definition with search required, the official estimate is 9.9 in Egypt. The ELMPS, the Labor Market Panel Survey estimate is 8.2, not 6.2. It is much closer. It is a period in which unemployment rates were falling dramatically. So the timing of the survey could have changed. The next survey in Egypt provides an estimate of 7.5%. So that you can see that just timing could have explained this difference very adequately. In Jordan, again, if you use the correct definition, which is the market definition and the search required, you get 15.1, which is very close to the national estimate of 15.3. In Tunisia, again, if you use the market definition with search, 13.7 compared to the 15.0 in the now. These discrepancies, of course, are much smaller than what Nelly claims they are, but they could also result from differences in data collection methodologies and not just in definition. So we find that the labor market panel surveys, which are in the column on the right, basically require that you meet and interview the individual him or herself. And so even if the individual him or herself is having trouble finding work but has some work, they're considered employed, but their family may think that they're unemployed because they're having trouble finding work, they don't have a regular job, etc. The labor force surveys, the official ones, don't have the budget to interview the individual him or herself. They ask anybody in the household, and that could be explained somehow the somewhat higher unemployment rates found there. So it's not necessarily a definitional issue then. Now, I also find that there were all kinds of incorrectly calculated unemployment rates, even if you agree on the definition. So this is not recalculated. This is based on published sources from the Labor Market Panel Survey, the same sources that Nelly used, and the calculations she made are simply incorrect. And I think it's a problem of how to use the weights properly that results in these wrong estimates. So the only one that came out correctly is the extended definition with search required, but all the ones are several percentage points off. And so if the World Bank is going to give recommendations to country statistical offices to correctly calculate and consistently calculate indicators, they should start by doing it themselves. The female labor force participation. So the paper showed very clearly in the descriptives that female labor force participation rates are falling if you correct for education. if you control for education. So we have overall flat or falling participation rates despite rapidly rising educational attainment. That's been called the MENA paradox, because normally we have seen, as in the results that Nelly showed, there's a strong cross-sectional link between education and higher participation. Educated women participate at much higher rates. Despite that, overall rates are actually declining, if not flat or declining in many countries. And that's really because if you control for education, the rates are declining. Educated women are participating at lower rates. Now, the presentation attributed that to maybe economic growth affecting participation rates. But there wasn't really an interpretation provided for why educated women are participating at lower rates. Is it increasing conservatism? The society is becoming more conservative. I think I've done a lot of work on this over the past 20 years, and I'm absolutely certain that the interpretation of this is a declining public sector employment, which has been the primary sector of employing educated women. And as public sector deployment declines because of structural adjustment and fiscal pressures, which is happening in all of these countries, women have fewer opportunities. The private sector is extremely inhospitable to women, especially to married women, if not outright hostile to married women. And that therefore married women drop out from the labor force when they, when women marry, they drop out from the labor force if only private sector jobs are available. However, if they're employed in the public sector, they remain employed, therefore the higher participation rates. So what we see is this generational issue. It's that the older generation had access to public sector jobs. They still have these jobs. The younger generation does not have access to these jobs, and they're participating at lower rates. So that's an important explanation that needs to be put forward, and the presentation simply does not do that. Now, in terms of the Oaxaca blinder decomposition, which Nelly showed, I think it's a useful exercise. However, it has no ability to distinguish between cohort effects and age effects. So it looks at the comparison between old and young cohort, but that comparison could be because these two cohorts have different experiences of the labor market over their entire life cycle, or it could be because participation changes with age. And with one cross-sectional data set, it's impossible to distinguish between these two effects. You need multiple cross-sections to be able to say something about what you're observing is a cohort effect or an age effect. And so making strong conclusions about generational, i.e. cohort effects from data that is cross-sectional is very misleading.
Ragui, if you could wrap up.
Okay. So I'm not going to comment on informality. I hope that's what Mona is going to do. But let's say, what have we learned from this presentation? What have we learned? Yes, definitions do matter, and we have to be explicit about the definitions we use. We need to settle on what is standard definition and what are variations on that. And the ILO has very strong recommendations about what should be the standard definition, and we should be quite explicit about that. However, we need to be careful that we correctly calculate things based on these definitions, and I think that the presentation doesn't do that. And the report by the World Bank doesn't do that. And then finally, I want to say that the problem is not so much inconsistent definitions, but it's an absence of indicators, an absence of data, and lack of access. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ragui. If you could stop sharing your screen in case Mona wants to use it.
Yeah, Ragui can keep his informality comments, since he can keep them on the screen if he likes. The informality comments, because I actually.
Do you want me to do that? Okay.
Yeah, because I can.
You can use his bullet points.
Yes, informality, because now he left it to me, so maybe we can use his comments.
Very good. So while Ragui does that, let me just remind viewers that you can write a question in the Q&A. Someone's written one in the chat, but the Q&A is probably a better place. And if you want to come in and ask a question in person, do raise your hand in the participants bar.
Okay.
Ragui's now trying to find you.
That's fine. Shall I start?
Go ahead, Mona, over to you.
Yeah, right. So it's always very difficult to top Ragui, to speak right after Ragui in any comment, in any conference or any discussion comments. So I would like to just complement what he said by some additional, insights. I mean, I'll start like him by agreeing that the central message of the report is indeed very important, and I do agree fully that lack of data and transparency have affected short and long-term outcomes in the region, including in the labor market. They not only improve policy making and the analysis we provide for policymakers, but also overall public discourse, academic work with applications to the MENA region. So this is very worthwhile to highlight in those two areas that the report, including the labor market. The second point, of course, I agree with is that it is very important that we have access to the raw data as researchers, because it's very frustrating when we're unable to replicate the official reported figures. And in order to do more in-depth analysis, we need to start with the ability of replicating and understanding very clearly and transparently how the figures were arrived at, and then we try to analyze and answer the question of why we have the observed trend. But I would like to underscore what Ragui said, that it is definitely, from our point of view as both producers, because we participate in producing some of this data as researchers, and consumers of data, we are never struck by the problem, which I find surprising, that the problem is lack of adherence with international definitions of the ILO. In fact, there is a very long history of technical support of ILO teams to statistical agencies in Egypt. And if there is one thing, and I think, Nelly herself in her presentation showed that almost all of the countries abide by the ILO unemployment. When it comes to the employment definition, it is not specified, as she said. It's not like they don't. The only countries that don't seem to be Djibouti and maybe Iran in the working age population. So I think definitely this is not something to be emphasized, and the problem with handling data should not stop at following definitions at all. The other thing I would add to what Ragui said on that is I'm not sure if it's useful to keep emphasizing that the extended definition of, as opposed to the market definition, which includes primary activities in the rural sector, which make a difference in the calculation of female labor force participation in countries that are still rural, like Egypt or Tunisia, not so much in Jordan. I'm not sure if this is really the right figure that we need. Yes, we're aware that once we count this as work, we'll have a higher female labor force participation, but this is not the type of participation that a modern inclusive economy is really promoting. So it makes all the sense in the world that we keep referring to those market definitions and not the extended definitions. And I don't see the point of emphasizing the extended definitions. The market definitions are still very low for a country like Egypt. And Tunisia and Jordan. Now, the three countries that most of this work has been done on are actually countries that have made, thanks to the effort of ERF, made this data available to researchers, the micro data behind the Tunisian, Jordanian, and Egyptian labor market panel surveys available. And therefore, there is a huge amount of literature and a huge now amount of empirical studies that have been published in very good journals and lots of working papers and conferences. So I would like to comment on the rest of my comments to really be centered around wearing two hats. One hat as an academic or someone who teaches labor economics in the region. And therefore, a report like this report by the World Bank is something that I would use in my teaching material. And in fact, I've already pointed my students to it. And the other hat is as a researcher and consumer of this data, participant in production of some kind of data, as well as possibly using it to provide policy advice. So just, an important point to be made as an academic is that, the World Bank need to be really aware that their reports are used and referenced as sources of data. It's very important that before a report that tackles this issue is published, that it should go through some form of peer reviewing and presentations before and not after the fact, where those sort of comparisons are done, because it really confuses the picture if the same data source is used to produce completely different measures of unemployment, female labor force participation, and informality. I find that the differences are quite significant when it comes to unemployment, maybe less significant, but still important for female labor force participation. So that's why, we have conferences, we have peer reviewing in order to spot those things. So it is very important that, this process happens before and not after reports are published. And this is, thinking about it as an academic who uses this in their teaching material. Now, looking at the results as a researcher, I do understand that it is interesting always to do this decomposition techniques, and I'm going to limit really my comments here to the female labor force participation results. These decomposition techniques are a very clear conceptual way of trying to see where the a first step in trying to find the causes or the reasons why we have certain observed trends. So why do we observe low female labor force participation in the MENA region? However, we need to be careful that we're asking the right question, the right policy relevant question. So the difference between the old and the young cohort, in my view, is not the most important question. The most important question is why, despite the rise in education and other factors that should lead to higher female labor force participation, those figures remain persistently low. In fact, in Egypt, Nelly reported that there is no difference between the young and the old cohorts. There's still very low rates of participation, 20 plus, which is something that needs really to be explained. And as Ragui said, there has been, a group of work that came out that shows that this has to do with the conditions of work that have not changed for women, and we can link that to the global trends in female labor force participation. If you look at the history, and I think the report does a good job. Nelly didn't get the chance to cover this part, but does a good job by comparing, what happened to the history of female labor force participation in the US during the Second World War, for example, with Yemen under conflict, and for us just to think what happens, in the secular trend over a long period of time. And what was highlighted is that there was this added worker effect where men go out to war, or men die, or go and fight abroad, and therefore women come in, and then men come back, women don't leave the labor force. So there is this added worker effect. But the history of integration of women in Western societies and in the US showed very clearly that it was also the two most important factors were actually real wages increasing for women is a very important factor, and conditions of work in general, in convincing women to participate. And secondly, also it is the increase in the feminized sectors. So it's always good to integrate women in the typically male-dominated sectors, but what really increases female labor force participation is policies and trends that result in an increase in sectors such as certain manufacturing sectors, food processing sectors, the care economy, social sectors. These are very good employers for women because of the conditions of work, because of even the stereotyping seems to work, for the benefit of women in these. So I think that brings me to the point of what additional data that we need. And of course, we need to think about the current phase we're in, the post-COVID world now. Some preliminary studies and data collection took place in the US and the UK and Germany, published in ISA, that showed that the most worrying trend in the post-COVID labor market adjustment, and where we need to collect data, has to do with the fact that there is an unequal impact. Groups that were marginalized, such as women, continue to be ones that bear the brunt. They're the first to be fired, and they're the first to witness a decline in wages, or in being converted to part-time workers with the view of letting go of them eventually. So the kind of new data, of course, yes, we need this individual level data that we collect through household surveys, but we also need to look at the enterprise response and collect data from the employer side, including in-depth qualitative interviews with employers. And what we have really drastically missing in the MENA region, which is we have some establishment level and enterprise surveys, and we have some household level surveys, but we don't have matched employer-employee data to look at how we link what's happening at from the individual preferences of workers with the employer preferences, and only there can we really collect meaningful data for meaningful analysis about the inequality impact and the distributional impact of the post-COVID response. Now, Ragui wanted me to say a few things about informality. I think Nelly showed the two basic ways where informality is measured from a contract point of view, whether workers have a contract and whether workers have access to social security. The other way of measuring informality, of course, is from the enterprise side. When we look at registered firms, and we look at firms who have licenses, bookkeeping, etc. And that's why we have very different measures of informality, whether we look at it from the informality of the enterprise or the informality of the worker. But if we look at from the policymakers' point of view, what they would like is really measures of, or analyses of who are the most vulnerable groups that are going to be affected and will not have any sort of coverage from their own enterprises. And of course, these would be the workers outside establishments. And we have measures of these, not in all the countries, but in the 3 countries that are quoted here that have the panel surveys. We have very good measures of who are the workers who work outside establishment in an informal way. So we need to use that as a database to get together with the databases of the existing social protection, such as the Takaful and Karama and similar conditional cash transfers and cash transfer programs in MENA countries, to use those as databases to decide on the size and the amount of protection in the short and the long term. Once we think about introducing new institutions such as unemployment benefits, there is a third definition that the ILO uses of unemployment that also is worth calculating and asking questions about in questionnaires, which is the narrow definition of unemployment. It would be the one. It would cover the workers who are not. It would result, I think, in a smaller unemployment figure, but these are the ones who are more actively seeking beyond just reporting to labor offices, but they are really actively seeking in the labor market. So new times call for new data, and I agree with Ragui that it's the lack of data more than the actual abidance with international definitions that seems to be the main issue to be highlighted in the labor market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona. You ran over a little, but it was good stuff. And you speak so fast, it was hard to get a word in. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you to all our panelists. Now, we started a little late, so I'll let us run over another 10 minutes, which I think we started about 10 past. So I think all our 3 presenters have been so comprehensive that we haven't had any questions coming. Oh no, hand went up and then quickly went down again. There's a question in the chat, which all of you alluded to, which was around making sense of this lack of increase in the female labour force participation, and some questions about what explains that. I think the best thing to do, though, is for me to hand over to Nelly and let her respond to a lot of the comments that Ragui and Mona made, and then I'll invite Nelly's colleague who led on the report, Daniel Liederman, to contribute a few thoughts as well. Nelly, over to you.
Thank you, Ramesh. I'd like to thank Ragui and Mona for the rich discussion. I will start by responding to some of the points that were made by Ragui regarding the calculation of the unemployment rate. First, I'd like to highlight that the results that were reported on the unemployment rate relying on the extended definitions were also mentioned in all the footnote tables. So this was also in the policy brief. So we said, we had mentioned that these were the results relying on the extended definitions. And I've also checked earlier work that was made by Ragui, and we find the exact same figure. So I think most of the discrepancies that Ragui had shown are actually due to the differences between whether we rely on the extended or the market definition rather than an incorrect estimation. So I have a few figures that I have computed relying on Ragui's previous work that I would like to project here. So these are the results from Ragui's previous work and the estimates that we have for the MENA economic update, and the differences are quite marginal when it comes to the total unemployment rates. And when it comes to the male unemployment rate, the results are also quite marginal. In many cases, it's less than 0.1 percentage point difference between our estimates and Ragui's estimates. And the largest differences are for female unemployment rate, but they are still quite marginal. And importantly, I would like to highlight that the main message that we're making in the report is not that we are advancing the estimation that we are computing when we are computing the unemployment rates. But importantly, we wanted to highlight that there are gaps between the national estimates and the figures that exist relying on independent data sources such as the labor market surveys. So even if we look at your results, Ragui, here from Egypt in 2018, if we rely on the market definition search required, you have a 19.5% of unemployment rate for women, while the national estimate is 21.4%. And if anything, our estimate 20.6% is closer to the national estimate. So I think this was the first point that I wanted to make. And the second point regarding the fact of non-compliance versus the problems of absence of data, we totally agree on this point. And this is one of the messages that we brought in the report. It was about saying that we rely on the statistical capacity index, which takes into account not only the compliance with international standards, but also takes into account the data availability as well as the periodicity of publication of this data. And we also confirm what Ragui said by saying that we actually find that the statistical capacity index, for instance, in Egypt, is the highest among most MENA economies. As for the point that Ragui made regarding female labor force participation rates and the role of public sector employment, we totally agree on this point about the importance of public sector employment for women in Egypt. However, I disagree with Ragui when he said that female labor force participation rates are higher among the older cohort and lower among the younger cohort, because we actually found the opposite pattern, and we found that educational differences do matter a lot when we compare the female labor force participation rate for women depending on whether they belong to the young or old cohort. And your point, Ragui, is well taken on the differences between the extended and market definition. And I think this is also an issue that Mona had raised as well. And I have actually checked on the ILO website, and it said that the employment includes all types of employment, whether this is also unpaid family work or any type of unusual work, but I guess I will have to double check again, because Ragui mentioned that this was later on then changed to only include market economic activities. However, what I would like to highlight is that the main message still holds, which is to say that putting aside any methodological differences, there are still differences depending on the definition that we use, and importantly, even if we rely on a different methodological estimate, there are still some gaps between the national and the estimates that we compute relying on independent data sources such as the ELMPSs. And finally, regarding Ragi's points, I'd like to address what's the contribution that we had in this report. First, I think the presentation covers only part of the report, so that's definitely something that is important to mention, that of course, if the panelists will check the total report, they will find that we had also some important discussion on the statistical capacity. We also brought discussion on the differences between definitions, which I think they were engaged in the previous literature. However, I think it's totally new to contrast national estimates compared to these various definitions and to also address this in the context of data transparency. So I think this is a very important discussion to bring, and it's very important to highlight these differences. And I agree with Ragui and with Mona when we say that documentation is very important, and that it's very important to document the way these various definitions are computed, and this will allow to have consistent estimates across MENA economies. As for the discussion by Mona, I thank you very much for all the points that you raised. And I think that we did not, I mean, when we present the table discussing the definitions of unemployment and how they are, whether they are consistent or not with the ILO definition, at no point we said that we said clearly when it was not specified that it was it was unspecified. And throughout the report, we also said that even if they do use these definitions, we are not capable of saying that they did use it or not, because in fact they did not report exactly what type of definitions they used. So I think this is a very valid point. And we totally also agree with you on the point that you made about the importance of the availability of microdata. And we're totally grateful for the ERF and for the ERF for making this data available. And we're totally grateful for all efforts that are made to make any data publicly available and to allow a researcher to use data for analysis. As for your point about the conditions of work and the role of wages and the increase in feminized sectors and the role that these indicators or these conditions would have in order to increase female labor force participation rates in MENA, we totally agree as well that this is like a problem that has many dimensions to it, and we agree totally that the question of education could be one of the main explanations, and that's what we're trying to advance in this report, to just bring attention not only to the question of public versus private sector employment or the combination of married life and engagement in labor market, but also to bring attention about the importance of educational differences and the fact that we observe that women who are younger are becoming much more educated, and that this could provide a way to think about the future female labor force participation rates and to think whether this could actually lead to an increase in the future. And I think I've covered most of the points. I'll let Daniel respond if he has any other things.
Thank you very much, Nelly. We're nearly out of time. There are some questions in the Q&A that perhaps the panelists could all look at and see if they would like to type a response. Some nice compliments about the high quality of the presentation. I'm going to give the last word to Daniel Liederman, who led on the whole World Bank report on the region on transparency that came out last month. Daniel, we'd like to say a few final words.
Thank you very much, Ragui, Mona, Shireen, Ramesh, for yet again hosting this lively technical discussion. I think we've fulfilled our mission. There were a couple of comments regarding the World Bank. The World Bank does have an internal review process that's quite rigorous. It's not the same as anonymous peer review processes for journal articles. We will get through those hoops soon as Nelly and I find time to write our academic paper. However, we're very comfortable with what's published in the report. First, the ILO definition at the time of writing is the ILO definition at the time of writing. I remember having preliminary discussions in person with Ragui when he visited us in Washington last year, and he mentioned that the ILO was in the process of revisiting those definitions. We look forward to the revised definitions. Regardless, I think it's important to show, as Ragui and his co-authors have been doing for decades, showing how the estimates change, how sensitive they are to different definitions, because it's important for policy. Mona mentioned that she still likes the market definition because it's a more dignified definition of work, as opposed to including all of the hardworking rural women who are trying to feed their families by employing themselves in subsistence activities. I think that it's important to document the magnitude of the share of the female labor force that's dedicated to those activities, precisely because they will probably require specific policies, since it's possible that growth alone will not change the precariousness of that type of employment. Anyway, I hope to see all of you and Mona and Ragui in other academic instances. I still have some issues to discuss offline with Mona and especially Ragui about the panel dimension versus the cross-sectional dimension and the interpretation of the blinder Oaxaca decompositions. I'm still a little bit puzzled, and I'm not new to research or to using panel data from around the world. But we stand by the report, which is meant and designed to provoke discussion. And let me just finish with the following. If us, World Bank, don't have access to the labor force surveys that the authorities use to compute their basic labor market statistics, such as the unemployment rates, and then when you have access to independent sources of data, such as the ERF or other surveys that are not the same ones that are being used by the authorities, one has to start by checking whether or not the aggregate indicators in a given data set approach those that are published by the government, just to almost figure out if we have an issue with the sampling framework or whatever it is. And that's how this project started. We started trying to replicate with the independent data sources because we don't have access to the micro data that the governments use to actually compute their things. And so then we looked at the deep literature that Ragui and his co-authors have contributed over the years, and we saw that indeed in most of their papers they show the 4 different definitions of employment and 4 different definitions of labor force participation with dramatic variance across the definitions. And so that's when we say, well, we gotta accept that we can't replicate the national statistics, which led us down the path of trying to figure out what were the definitions so that we could see if we were using alternative definitions. The report just acknowledges that the authors of this World Bank report were unable to replicate the national statistics, and B, that definitions matter above and beyond the problems of access. He said the main problem that we face in MENA, which is how my story began, is that not even World Bank researchers have access to the underlying micro data sets, particularly labor force surveys, and even some of the consumption household surveys that are used to compute the official statistics on poverty. And I hope all of you join our webinar of June 1st, where our poverty team will present our latest report on data gaps for measuring monetary poverty in MENA and ways to overcome it. Thank you so much for for an invaluable technical discussion that we hope, as transparency and access to data becomes more readily available throughout MENA, that we'll be able to have more of these provocative, honest, candid technical discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Well, sadly, we are out of time. And sadly, the nature of the modern world that we have to meet in this way means that we can't all go for a coffee or a nice meal together and continue the conversation. But hopefully we will to be able to do that in the not too distant future. Daniel reminded that there's the final webinar in this series will be happening in early June. You'll be receiving details on that. Video recordings of the previous discussions are available via the ERF website. So it just remains for me to thank you all for joining us for this. Thank you for your questions and comments. And thank you particularly to our presenters. Thank you to Nelly. Thank you to Daniel. Thank you to Ragui. And thank you to Mona. Stay safe, everybody. Lovely to see you all. Take care.